Right. Well, for once, I'm not at home and I'm not in a winery. I'm in Jeremy's house in Louis Saint-Georges. And we've got a few of the wines that you're going to enjoy lined up. But maybe we'll start with a little bit of an introduction from Jeremy about the domain, and I will ask him difficult questions.
Okay. Yeah, no, this is work. Yeah, we're not here to have fun. So I visited the domain before, I'm sure, but we're a young domain by Burgundy standards. My father started it back in 1968. My grandfather was an industrialist, but really into wine. Let me just turn off my phone. And my father's an only child and had been to tasting with him at the estate bottlers of the era, who were not that numerous, but spent a lot of time in the cellars at Gouges, at Rousseau, d'Angerville, Ramonet, and so my father decided one day that this was something that he would rather do rather than work in the industrial world. And so my grandfather was also a small shareholder at Domaine de la Pousse d'Or. So he sent my father there for an apprenticeship. This would have been in 66 and 67. My father worked 2 vintages with Jarre, and then Jarre one day called him and said, "There's something for sale in Morey St Denis that you should have a look at." I'm trimming this a little bit. I think you have to look at a couple things. By the time it was a little easier to get started and get a foothold in Burgundy. And so he bought what was called Domaine Graillet at the time. In 1968, it came with 4 hectares of vineyards. So there was some Morey St Denis village, there was some Chambertin au Combottes, some Clos St Denis, and a tiny bit of Cru Roche. And that was it. That was the start. It's funny, MW came by a few years ago and asked my father if he'd ever tasted any Clos St Denis before he started. That was a big piece of Clos St Denis, much bigger than the piece of Cru Roche back then. He'd ever tasted any Clos St Denis before buying the vineyards. And no, my father had never tried any Clos St Denis. I don't think there was a whole lot of people who bottled it at the time. And
so it's beginner's luck.
So I said, well, how did you go about that? He said, well, based on where it was located, it had to make good wine. So yeah, I guess that's faith at the time was possible. The 1968 vintage, I'm guessing none of you would ever have tried any Burgundy from that vintage because it's generally reputed as worst of century. So there's several contenders, but it unquestionably is among the top 5. And it rained steadily, apparently, for at least 45 days straight leading up to harvest. And so there was botrytis everywhere. And my father had a sorting table. It was not one of those rolling things. It was just a table in which they sorted. They dumped the buckets and then try sorting through stuff. But he still said it was just terrible. There was nothing to be done. When you dump the bins full, there'd be this cloud of smoke, which was botrytis dust above the tanks, and so he spent a lot of the harvest saying it will never be worse. And I think that explains his generally optimistic nature at every harvest that has happened since then. There's a mantra which is, oh, it's just not as bad as 68, though, don't worry. Which is very reassuring because yes, if you survive that in your first harvest, you survive it shows you that there's some resilience in the business, which was necessary actually this year to hold on to that kind of thought. So right from the start, we didn't own a distemmer until 2000. So anything prior to 2000 would have been whole cluster. But he did borrow some distemmers on occasion. So every now and then you get a surprise. You're just like, wow, this wine doesn't taste what I would expect it to, and maybe there was some distemming going on. So for instance, 91, my father distemmed quite a lot because there was a hailstorm as part of the adapting to the conditions. 98, Bonnemar for some reason is heavily distemmed.
Can I ask a question, Jeremy? So nowadays there are people who don't destem or only do it in certain vintages, because they say that in the other years the stems aren't ripe enough, and yet almost every vintage between 68 and 2001, when you got more involved, would have been less ripe than the vintages today. So how does it work to have such great wines if the stems aren't ripe?
Well, for one, I like the fact that you call them great wine. Great wine, so that's, yeah.
Well, that's not every one of them, but plenty of great wines in that period.
But a whole cluster is quite fashionable these days, and it's unquestionably making a big advance in terms of the things that a lot of domaines are experimenting with. My father didn't do it out of fashion, and I continued doing it not out of fashion, is because it's how we know how to make wine. And I think that there's a number of people who are wading into the whole cluster world because they want to try it, because they've enjoyed wines made that way. But they're going at it very cautiously, which I can understand, because if I were to relearn a winemaking technique, I would proceed with caution. It's the stakes are pretty high. Although my father has done a whole bunch of things to 100% of the crop. Actually, you're having a 76 later, and I can talk about that later. But my father somehow, when he gets an idea, sometimes embraces it rather wholeheartedly and just goes charging ahead and doesn't necessarily bother with a control lot. He just goes and does 100% of the crop. But I think that there's safety in saying things are very ripe. I can do a little bit of whole cluster, because for such a long time in the wine world, if someone described a wine as vegetal, it was commercial death. And we were fortunate, because my father started in that do whole cluster, that we had an audience and a client base who accepted that and liked the wines we did, regardless of.
Also, in those days, there was no such thing as a wine critic. There were wine writers, but no critics.
And Burgundy's been fortunate that, present company excluded, there's no dominant voice of criticism that's really shaping how the wines are made. And Jasper.
And that is hugely important, because something Aubert de Villaine said to me in an interview I did with him, when I asked him what were the key things that made Burgundy a success. And one of the things he cited was that Robert Parker didn't like Burgundy, because he felt it would have been a disaster if Parker had come here and started boosting all the tiny production wines. Well, I mean, that particular genie is out of the bag now, and and we've seen what's happened to certain producers and certain small lots of wine, but at least it's been delayed compared to if Parker had been a Burgundy man.
And while the prices have certainly gone up, there's not this consensus on how wine should be made. I think you have a lot of individual voices in Burgundy that express different stylistic preferences between the wines that we make in a whole cluster manner, the wines that Echezeaux makes in a whole cluster manner, which are very, very different from ours. The wines that Leroy makes, or that a number of people make in fully destemmed ways. You have a variety of expressions of Pinot Noir and of Site, which I think hold plenty of merit. I mean, I think there's real pleasure in diversity and greatness, and so I think that's pretty great. So going back to Jasper's question about the less ripe, so I think in ripe vintages, hot vintages, like 16, I guess, that we're going to taste, or
why don't you start tasting the three 2016s while we talk?
Actually, there we go. I'm going to taste some Morey 16 ourselves.
So I think we've got the village. We've got a few wines, but not all of them. So we got one of the 2016s ourselves. We got the village wine. And not the Premier Cru or the Grand Cru.
We have it with counterfeit labels, though.
Yeah.
No one is as good at counterfeiting their own wine as the producer, of course. So anyway, in a warm vintage, it can bring a little bit of mintiness and some floral notes and some spicy notes, which I think can bring a lot of freshness and help counterbalance some of the very ripe fruit that you can have. And in vintages that are cooler, the stems contain quite a lot of potassium. So while they can bring some vegetable flavors, they also deacidify the wines a little bit. So we are having a 2008 later, which qualifies a very high acid vintage, a bit like 96. And the whole cluster nature, I think, helps offset or precipitate a little bit of the tartaric acid and actually round some of the edges. So we will
So can we talk a little bit about like what dudis are in the village and also what plots are in the Premier Cru? Curious about that.
So in the village, it's overwhelmingly Les Porous, which is right between the main road and the RN 974 and the Domaine. So we have a few blocks in there, and that represents probably 70% of the volume.
Sorry, I didn't catch that, Jeremy.
It's
I couldn't
called,
quite understand.
the lieu-dit is called the Porous, P-O-R-R-O-U-X. So you'll find that down near where the winery is. That's 70%, if you didn't hear Jeremy clearly. There's also a little bit, if you visited the winery, there are a few vines which are right adjacent to where you go into the winery with your grapes.
Exactly, called Le Village. So if you see just to the north of Clos la Bussière, there's a little bit called a block called Le Village, and it's within that. There's a lot of different places called Le Village. Anything that's really against the houses of the village. But we're in that part that's right between La Bussière and the actual town. Then we have some Clos a little further to the north, below Les Blanchards, and then we have some Herbottes.
But it's all low slope.
It's all lower slope. There's nothing above the Grand Crus or Premier Crus.
And anybody who's been to the Tour d'Argent will know quite how well this Morey St Denis lasts, because we had both the 76 and the 78 on more than one occasion.
Yeah. Great. Okay.
Good. And the Premier Cru
And
is
so the
from...
Premier Cru, the largest block we have and biggest by volume is Les Ruchots, which is between La Bussière and Clos. Then going to the north, we have some Clos Sorbet. We have a tiny amount, which would essentially amount to 1 barrel in a decent year. And we have some Miande, which is below Clos de la Roche, and some Charrière, which is above Les Herbottes and below Clos de la Roche as well.
So I'm just tasting this 2016. It feels too young for me, so I'm sure the Premier Cru and the Grand Cru will be even younger. But it's a vintage I really like, will be for the long term. So a frost year like 2021, but it's worked out quite differently. And having said it's a frost year, the one village which escaped mostly in 2016 was Morey St Denis. Fred Munier, while watching all his Chambolle vineyards getting frosted away, he checked the thermometer in his car, and then he drove over to Morey St Denis, and he reckoned there was about 5 degrees Celsius difference between the main street going up into Chambolle and the main street going up into Morey. So his view is that's why Morey escaped in 2016.
It's nice when producers who own Musigny and Bonnemar are envious of the vineyards in Morey St Denis, and confirms what I always thought, is that Morey St Denis is the throbbing, pulsing center of Burgundy.
Yeah.
No interest in bottling these separately, the Premier Crus or the Lieu-dits and the Blanche. Like I feel like some villages like Meursault, they want to like do everything like.
I think that there's sometimes the temptation. We make 21 different wines, not including the négoce, and so multiplying bottlings I find at times is an interesting exercise academically, but I do think our Morey Village is better for being blended. I think that makes a stronger village wine year to year. For the Premier Cru, we have a new winery that's under construction, which we'll be using from 2022. I think in 2023 there'd be a strong temptation to separate the Ruchots from the other Premier Crus. It's some of the Charrière and the Miande the Charrière and the Clos Sorbet are too small to vinify separately and get any consistency, because there are some years we'd be getting less than a barrel, and less than a barrel in red to vinify is just it's not better for the wine. But for the Ruchots, where we'd have actually probably a 6-7 barrel quantity, that would make sense. So I think we'll do that. In Meursault, the person who pioneered it was Guy Rouleau, and I believe, and I think it makes he had a large number of village sites, and they were much more different and much higher up on the hill. And I think that there's a reason that Rouleau, the Clos de la Baronne, which is the flatter part, he just calls it Meursault, and he separates his sites that are on the hill because they have stronger individual personalities. Yeah.
Do you ever declassify, if you had a new plantation of Grand Cru from Morey, would you declassify that into the Premier Cru?
Yeah, we've done that.
Young vines. Yeah.
We've been doing that actually with a little bit of Clos St Denis, and I can't remember if Clos St Denis, there might be a tiny bit of Clos St Denis 16 in the Morey.
Right. But from what you said, you think it's harder to identify a small amount of red than it is for white?
Yes, because white you ferment in barrel. So if you have one barrel, you're good. You can press one barrel white well, and it will be a small ferment. On reds, you're depending on the mass for the thermal inertia to carry you through the ferment. So it needs to get warm enough. So if you don't have the right kind of surface area to volume ratio, and you don't build up a little bit of inertia, it's really hard, and you get, well, you can get way too ethyl acetate even for your taste. So it's hard to move out of that phase sometimes when you're in a small batch.
I mean, it's going to be worth doing if you've got a barrel of Musigny like Christophe. You're not going to declassify that into Chambolle. The only person in red who really makes an issue of this is Pierre Roche, who in 2020 he's made 16 wines, 8 of them all red. 8 of them are 1 barrel or less. But he's in that case to do that. But it seems to work. The wine's very good. So so as I said, we've got the village one to taste there. Any comments is there a big step up for you between the village and the Premier Cru? And or Grand Cru?
Yeah, it feels like the Premier Cru is a step up. I mean, it's a little bit more serious. It just feels more serious, a bit more complexity. The mouth feels a little bit, I don't know how to describe it, but a little bit more wholesome.
You feel more fullness, and maybe it makes you salivate a little bit more?
I think so, with a Premier Cru. Yeah.
That's kind of my memory of it.
And the Clos de Roche. Should we talk about the vineyard when you've got that?
Oh yeah, so we've got a bunch of.
Yeah.
We have every lieu-dit or every climat, I should say, or lieu-dit, in Clos de Roche, with the exception of Les Mauchamps and Genévrières. So we've got, starting at the north, we've got Montmizon, some Clos de Roche, some Froidchaux, some Frémières, and some Chabiot. So it's really a cross section of the whole vineyard. We have just shy of 2 hectares. Usually it ferments in two tanks, depending on the order of picking, but we pick them all, we pick everything very tight together. And we blend them right from the start if we can, right after pressing. And so because we tried vinifying old vines separately from younger vines, and I don't think, I'm not a big fan of old vine cuvées, because I really hate seeing a Grand Cru or any great vineyard being referred to as the normal version and the old vine version. And it makes people skip right over something pretty special to go on to what they think is more special. And so I think that's just, and on top of that, if you've got a really good vineyard and you've been serious about not including vines that are too young or not performing, then it should all make it into the cut. I don't think there should be a Grand Vin, a Second Vin in Burgundy, a Grand Cru. I think if you've got a special piece of land, then all of it should go into the blend. There's some people who have vast surfaces of Grand Cru that might disagree with that particular vision of things. But anyway, and we can talk much more about selection. The Clos de Roche 16, I think that 2016 you find a real difference between the vineyards that got frosted. None of the vineyards that you're trying here have been frosted, but in our Echezeaux got frosted a little bit more heavily, and so did our Bonnemar. And I think that brings a bit of an angularity to some of those wines that got frosted. You have a bit more tannin, they're a little bit less instantly graceful. Everything with the 16s that didn't get frosted was very much in place right from the start, and you had wines that just were, they had such poise. They were just very pleasant in barrel and very, very enjoyable right from the start. The frosted ones are sometimes just a little bit more more angular, and for the whites, you really feel the frosted vineyards. They have an oiliness to them, which is kind of like
sweet Messiah effect.
Yeah,
The two generations. Right. Let's take a look maybe at the two, unless you got more questions on the first three, the next two, which are Echezeaux 14 and Malconsorts 14, which we don't have as it happens. But they should be fun.
yeah, you'll have to tell us about it. So 14 like 17 are vintage, is a vintage. There's vintages that you kind of see from the start as being really good. That would be the case with 16. There's vintages that you expect a lot of, and then you might feel a little bit more disappointed further down the line. And I'm sure I can come up with an example of that, but there's vintage you feel like you're waiting for forever for. And maybe 99 would be a bit like that. And maybe 05. And then there's vintages that are kind of sleepers. You think, oh, this is pretty good. And actually, I find the 14s right now, I mean, they've been steadily tracking. I've been getting more and more excited about them because they just jump out of the glass and they're really precise and they're just ripe enough. And I think that there's just real joy in that precision and that aromatic exuberance. And so I think they're in a really, really good place right now. And actually, they've been in a good place from the start. So haven't really shut down at any point.
I think there's a lot of interest in both 13 and 14, but I mean, short of the consistency across the board of the great vintages, in 14 there were some people who picked too early or got a bit clobbered by the rot which spread. But if you avoided those pitfalls, they could be lovely. And 13 was really difficult at the lower end, but had some great wines at the top end. So here we've got a Grand Cru of long date and a Premier Cru, which was not thought of as being particularly special until some visitors from Hong Kong tasted 2000 Romanée St Vivant from Catillar at Berry Brothers and Rudd, and as a result of that piled into Catillar, and then we all discovered that the Malconsorts was probably even better than the Romanée St Vivant, and it was really the Catillar success that catapulted Malconsorts into being first division. And it is great. And the peculiarity of this is it's actually from two different places.
Yes, absolutely. So there's, I'll have to tell you that maybe some stuff at the as for end of tastings.
Right.
So Echezeaux, we are in the Champ-Traversin part of Echezeaux, which is it's actually you're tasting the two wines from the both extremities of Vaune. You've got some of the northernmost Grand Cru of Vaune, and you've got the southernmost Premier Cru of Vaune. And Echezeaux, I suppose you could say, leans a little bit Chambolle, because since we moved to biodynamic, I really feel it's among the wines that consistently has very silky tannin in our cellar. There's a really nice gentleness and delicacy to Echezeaux. It tends to be a little lower alcohol as well. We tend to pick it. I feel like it works well in that being picked fairly early. And so we pick at the front end of our harvest. Our harvest only lasts about a week, but I pick the Malconsorts at the tail end of our harvest. So they're frequently a good 0.5%, maybe sometimes a bit more apart. And I really like with Echezeaux, it's usually 100% whole cluster. I really want to highlight the gentleness of it and the delicacy, and I think that that's where it expresses itself best. With Malconsorts, I tend to go in the opposite direction, where maybe it's the proximity to La Tâche, but I feel like La Tâche is a Grand Cru that really shines in being powerful and full-bodied, and it's not devoid of structure. Actually, it's quite structure-rich. Yeah. And Malconsorts, having done a vertical a year and a half ago, that of all our vintages and of De Montis and Udo Noelas and Catillar side by side, which was super interesting. Even across different winemaking styles, it is a very structure-driven wine, and that structure really lasts in time. So from 2020, I've eased off a little bit on the extraction, but up till then, I feel like you really feel a firm backbone to it. Oh, hi, Richard.
Hi, Jeremy. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Richard.
But it's also very fleshy. That's what took me a time to see just how much structure there was, is because there was, I think, quite a lot of flesh on those bones. And you find regularly some aromas of cocoa and of, I don't know, there's an unctuousness to Malconsorts. But at the same, but anyway, I should add to the side. So what Jasper was referring to is with the exception of that little,
You just got 2 blocks, really.
we have two
next to La Tâche.
We have 2 blocks, both of which actually touch La Tâche. But there's a little piece that's Christian, which is in that lower, that northeast corner, and let me just go to the map.
Or bottom right on the map.
Exactly.
I always sort of think the north ought to be the top of the map. Of course, it isn't.
Oh, no,
It's
actually,
west.
this one, it's Vineyard, so it is. But anyway, and then we have that little sliver of, technically it's Godichaux, that is alongside Les Godichaux La Tâche. And then we have Malconsorts proper to the south of that, and then that touches that toe in La Tâche. Depending on what app you're looking, we're just below the L of La Tâche. Anyway, so it's a hectare 57, and it's in a very exciting location. And I feel like as time goes by and we understand the vineyard better, we're making a better and better job out of it. And just certainly you'll feel, I think that 14 is in many ways a more complete wine than the 05 we're going to have a bit later, but
It's the first vintage.
you'll be able to tell me.
Yeah. I was interested in your point about the structure of Malconsorts, because I came to it, as just mentioned, really through Cattillard, and he does wines of plumpness and flesh, or the father, more than the structure. And so I just saw the incredible flesh in the wine, which you also mentioned. But it's true that with certain others, you do see a bit more structure, but you still get a really hedonistic flesh in Malconsorts as well.
The Cattillard that we tried as they were getting older, I felt had plenty of structure as well. You really felt some tannin and a firmness on the end that came on every wine that I said, tell you, Hugues de Noëlla, which is not the most extracted or tough wines that are out there, also have this kind of this tannin grip. Now, granted, we're also tasting 60 wines, so maybe I was a little more sensitive to the tannin than I would have been otherwise. But for me, it was really across from De Monty. It was expected, although Etienne makes much more gentle wines than his father did, and you felt the whole cluster destemmed, new oak, less new oak.
You still got a character of Malconsorts, which is why it should be a Grand Cru, but still. Those of you who've got them side by side, then, do you have a preference between Echezeaux and Malconsorts?
Echezeaux is looking better.
Is showing superbly.
I'm not sure if it's Alvaro, but the Malconsorts is a little bit rubbery. There's a petrol thing etched to it. I'm not sure if that's what it should be, but it's a little bit rubbery.
Bubbly.
Yeah, slightly, but obviously you get the firmer tannins. You can definitely get coming through. The Echezeaux, I think, just seems to be in a really nice spot, even at this age. You get that lovely sort of that slight graininess you get to Echezeaux sometimes. But I think the Malconsorts perhaps just needs that little bit more time to get a bit more comfortable with itself. I think on the tannin side.
And if you've got a bit of carbon dioxide in there, it will shake out or move out, but that would undoubtedly, when we try to bottle with fairly high CO2 actually, because I feel like it does a nice job of preserving the wines and keeping them lively. Sorry?
Meant to be a sparkling wine.
Well, we all have our ambitions, but I don't want it to be so sparkling the cork pushes out.
There is another producer who greatly regrets his facetious comment, Jean-Marie Fourier. He told somebody who was saying how much gas there was. He said, well, just give it a shake. That's what you need to do. And since then, people refer to the Fourier shake. He's furious about it because he only meant it as a sort of a offhand comment.
Well, if ever you want to come up with a Dujac anything, I'll take it well. Let me tell you, I'll take it. Yeah, no, I think that when you have a bit more carbon dioxide, everyone has different thresholds for it. I like the way it lifts the palate, but also it makes the tannin pop out a little bit more. So it might be worth getting a few extra spoons.
I didn't get that sensation, but I thought aromatically, it was much sweeter than Malconsorts, like almost more nectary. Whereas the Echezeaux had more of a higher, more lifted, more precise.
That's, I think, what I'd expect, a refinement out of Echezeaux and sort of sweetness and charm and immediacy out of Malconsorts, even if it's a little bit tamed by its bubble. Okay, next up are three 2010s. Village Combottes and Clos de la Roche. We're going to join you in the Clos de la Roche. But I have to say, Combottes is just one of my great favorite vineyards from. I thought it was one of my favorites overall, but it turns out to be it's the Dujac one that really does it for me. And he's one of the great reference point wines. And then we have the Clos de la Roche. But we've all come to fall in love with 2010 as a vintage, have we?
Oh yeah, that's a good vintage. I feel like in a way 2010 is to 2009, and a little bit what 2016 is to 2015. Although I put 15 ahead of 2009. But it's that slightly cooler set of circumstances coming after. There's something that's very joyful about ripe Pinot. It can be really enjoyable and generous, but there's something about those slightly cooler vintages, the precision that comes with them, and the way they unfold over time, which is, I think, more pushes it a little bit to another level. And there's a grace to the tannins of 2010. When we were first tasting them in the winery, they were really very mouth coating and they stuck around for a long time, but very rapidly during the élevage and then in bottle, they softened, and I think now there's a grade of tannin in 2010 that you don't see too often.
I mean, it was nearly an October vintage, and the growing season had been pretty cool and cloudy, not actively nasty, but people were quite worried at one period, and I was just thankful to have got more or less healthy grapes through to the end. And then we discovered that it's really very good indeed.
Yeah. The top end of 2013 is not entirely unlike that.
Yeah.
Both vintages had a poor fruit set and a lot of shot berries, a lot of mirandage, and that usually pans out well. It works, and especially for a whole cluster, I feel like that's the kind of grapes I'm most comfortable working with. Yeah.
And incidentally, they were both naturally small vintages, whereas there are some other vintages which are small because people have to throw a lot of grapes away. You didn't have to do that in 2010. They were healthy. And he's just chucked his away. I'm not going to do that.
No, this is by 2016.
Oh, right. That's his village Morey. Good. Are they all in good nick?
The Combottes and Morey are heat affected.
Yeah, there's some really real taste about Morey.
Oh, the Morey, oh dear. Oh
And the
well.
Combotte as well?
Just in the Morey.
No, and the Combotte. The Clos de la Roche is so different, so good.
Yeah.
And the colour is also so much clearer than the other two whites. I think I don't know what everybody else feels, but there's some heat problem, storage problem.
The Malconsorts had the same issue for me.
The more it has a fair bit. The Clos de la Roche is just like it. That purity of fruit.
Yeah. It's interesting that the profile is the Clos de la Roche. It's a little bit reductive, with more of the kind of the vitamin-y, closer to the Bon Mar type profile, and not the full of the younger ones. I like it a lot.
It's pretty color.
Yeah, these two are
Just a bit muddled, right? You can see it in the colour.
Right. I mean, of course, I have no idea where the wines haven't come direct from the domain, so I don't know.
But do you feel they're more oxidized or is it cork, or is it something else?
It's oxidized. The fruit is very dark. I don't know.
Yeah.
Which
So primitively brown in colour and with that kind of.
That's not right. Yeah. So I'm afraid that's an issue with those bottles, because that is totally not consistent with anything I've tasted 2010s, well, from anybody, but especially from Dujac here in Burgundy.
Oh, and actually, as part of this bag, you have the RSV.
Yeah. I'm disappointed in that, particularly with the Combotte, which I would have been looking forward to had I been there with you. Right.
Jasper.
Yeah.
Jasper, can I ask a quick question on Combotte, because I think it was Jeremy. I heard him speaking to Atkin about it, and it's very true. It seems to be massively underappreciated in the market. It's surrounded by Grand Cru. It makes great wines, but you're looking at the levels of the hierarchy of Premier Cru. It never seems to be in the sort of in people's thoughts. Jerry, is there a reasoning you think behind that?
Part of what makes that conversation of, oh, this Premier Cru should be upgraded or whatever is the growers who are making wine from it. So there's no question that if you're looking at Clos St Denis, you have a group of super performing growers over decades. In the case of Combotte, it's only 4.5 hectares. We have 1.15 hectares out of it. And so the remaining 3 hectares is split between a vast number of growers. And
many of whom don't have enough to bottle it on its own.
Yeah, there's a few growers who blend it. And so I think there's perhaps a shortage of high profile growers as well.
Cyprien Arlo's got it. It's only recently that he's been up in the high profile group. Roussillon Trappet have it, but they don't really sell it. Trappet has it, but until 2020 or 21, it's been blended with other things.
There's Leroy, and there's Bernier, historically would have been among the top growers.
Also, it's not consistent. It's done in a dip, which is why it's not Grand Cru, and it's not completely consistent because you have different soil types within Combotte, and the bits nearer the forest probably cool off earlier. But otherwise, if you're a little bit further down the slope, you actually get really good evening sunshine, because the Morey St Denis, Clos de la Roche, Mont-Louison hillside goes way back up almost to the top, so there aren't trees blocking the evening sun. Whereas if you're in the Chambertin next door, the evening sun or late afternoon sun even is completely blocked by the forest. So that makes a little bit of a difference. So in fact, the Roussillon Trappet, they pick their Combotte first and their Chambertin last, even though they're next door to each other. As I say, my reference for me has always been yours, and I really have always loved it. What can I say? Let's have a look.
In any case, I think it's better to have a Premier Cru that's overperforming than a Grand Cru that's slightly controversial. People get more excited about Combotte when we serve it than they get excited about Chambertin, even though Chambertin really is pretty good as vineyards go.
Which is one of the couple of sort of top names that you haven't got this evening, along with the Vosne Beaumont, which I like a lot. I'm just going to look to see if I've got any other Combotte producer information for you. No, those are the main ones that we've talked about, I think. Pierre Amiot, not very top class. Domaine Dujac, also have it. Georges Lignier, not top flight for me. Right, so alongside the 3 2010s, and I apologize, only one of them is performing, you have a 2008 Domaine St Vivant, and so do we, which, since I very, very rarely get to see this wine in bottle. So 2008, a late vintage, cool vintage, a difficult growing season, but possible to make fine wines.
A lot of Mirandage as well. And this was 100% whole cluster. We typically never destem the Domaine St Vivant, and I did a tiny bit in 2021, but we definitely did not in this vintage. In a normal year, I make 600 liters, so 200-300 liter cask. In 08, it would have been a bit less. I can't remember if it was 2 barrels or if it was 1 barrel and 1 300 liter barrel. but anyway, it's a small amount. We're not declassifying it to make Von Romanet Premier Cru blend. I've complained about small batches, but we may try.
But it doesn't get released in general into the market.
Exactly. No, we after 2009, where 2009 we released it, and I think 3 weeks later I got some mailers in my inbox from auction houses that were offering it, and I thought, this is really not in the spirit of what we're trying to do. So we've just held it back, and I'm sure at some point we'll get around to releasing our share. But some of it makes its way into the market because the owner of the vineyard, Wilf Jager, sells quite a lot of his portion of the crop, so it does show up. But anyway, there you go. I was telling you about, so this is whole cluster in a cool vintage, and I feel like some 08s can be very angular. You really the acidity makes the tannin stick out. You end up with a lot of elbows, but there the pH is quite normal. It's for red Burgundy. I feel like on top of that you have Romanet St Vivant, which is a quality of tannin which is I should close that shutter. I'm just realizing that. Okay. Anyway, Romanet St Vivant is always quite round and softer, and so I think it makes for a nice expression of that vineyard.
Pretty good. I mean, the half bottle we got here is absolutely on cracking form. Still young, but certainly practical. Good to drink. We're just stopping the sunshine coming across and flooding the screen. I've gone all dark now.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. And the length of flavour of this wine is just head and shoulders above even the Clos de la Roche. So it's from your wise nodding, it sounds as though that you have got a very good bottle there too, and a very rare bottle. Not that rarity has anything to do with quality. So, I like to say.
Otherwise, the Bourgogne Blanc from Domaine Dujac would actually be much more sought after.
It's really changed in the glass. Just in 5 minutes in the glass, it's absolutely blossomed. And I wouldn't mind starting to drink that now. I mean, it's got a big upside still. I don't see why you shouldn't start it. Now, in theory, that's as long as we are going to accompany you up to those wines. But as it happens, Jeremy's also got a couple of older wines. A couple of other wines. We've also got the 05 Malconsorts and the 01 Clos St Denis, since we haven't yet had Clos St Denis. So maybe talk a little bit about Clos St Denis and Bon Mar, so two vineyards that we haven't had today.
So I feel like when contrasting Clos St Denis and Clos la Roche, which are adjacent, and they share a lot in terms of soil, but they have different microclimates, because Clos St Denis is more in the Combe, especially ours. The bulk of our Clos St Denis is in Les Calouères, and then we have some Clos St Denis and Chaffaut that may get a tiny piece of Chaffaut, and so when you're in the Combe, you get more diurnal shifts. You get you go through the night-day temperatures shift more, and so the Clos St Denis is always, it leans a little bit more floral, a little bit more silky on the tannin front. It's a lighter wine, whereas the Clos la Roche is always a bit more structure, a little bit more warmth from the spice, a little bit more musky. So they're just very.
It's a little bit simplistic, but I think you can liken Clos de la Roche with Bon Mar and with Chambertin, insofar as that they are more of a matte finish to your paint rather than a glossy finish. Mm-hmm. Whereas Clos St Denis is in the same family as Musigny, and all about the excitement and the richness of attack. And they sort of, between Clos de la Roche and Clos St Denis, they sort of play in and out over sort of 5, 10, 15-year periods as to which one takes the highlight. And
some vintages are, it turns on little sometimes. Which wines are your most successful in a vintage is about catching them at the right time. And so in the case of some vintages, 05 for me is a Clos St Denis vintage. 2016 is a Cru Roche vintage, and so you go through, it goes through phases. I'll say a quick word about Malconsorts 05 because it was our first vintage. We bought well, it was not the vineyard. We bought the company that owned the vineyard in July 2005. Actually, a week after I got married. So it was a busy summer for me and one of big commitments. But we so essentially we didn't have any control of the vineyard. We got to pick it, but that's as far as it went. And so because we didn't have direct ownership of the vineyard or direct farming, that's why it's under the négociant label. So it's under the Dujac Fils et Père label. And I do think that while the 05 Malconsorts is a delicious wine, it's very, very different from the vintages that followed. I feel like that structure, as the next year, in 06, we started moving to organic farming. We moved to biodynamics. We started having grass in the rows. The whole thing changed quite a lot. And I think our farming does lead to thicker skins. And I think that you see that in the vintages that follow 05. 05 it's much softer than any other wine in the cellar in 2005. All the vineyards that came from all the new vineyards in 05 were softer. And Bonne changed quite a lot post 05 or 05 onwards because we got a little piece which came with the same sale from Waya. And so that little piece of 0.14 hectares is all white soils. And so it shifted our red to white soil balance in Bonne. The red soils are more clay rich, more iron rich, and they tend to be, as it were, the earth forces in that wine. They bring the power and the structure and that very, I feel like I always think of Cru Roche as an athletic wine. It's just, it's kind of sinewy. There's nothing extra to that wine. It's quite firm, and the white soils, which are more marl and limestone rich, bring the floral side, and they bring a lightness. But sometimes I feel like they can fall a little bit short because they can just lack substance. And so the blend of both, I think, is that's the way Christophe Roumier does it, and if Christophe Roumier does it, it has to be true and right. So. So that's been my position. I'm sticking to it, but I feel like the blend of both. So it moved our Bonne from being a very firm wine to being somewhat more.
At least a couple of people around that table were at Domaine Roumier when we persuaded Christophe to put a 1990 Bonne, one in the white soil and one in the dark soil, and that was really it.
We expect that every time we go to a Burgundy.
Yeah, it remains. Even for me, it remains one of my truly outstanding experiences. And,
yeah, I want to be there for that. Why didn't you call me?
Not that far.
Could have been there.
You could have. Yes.
Wait, I heard you guys recently did it again. Icy was saying that
just did it. Icy was there. We just did it again with 2010.
What the fuck?
2010. Okay.
Yes.
I thought you were my friend.
That was with the symposium group that we had. Yeah. Okay. Well, at some other point we'll go around to Christophe and say, "Hey, Christophe." Good.
Well, enjoy your dinner.
No, well, we've also got the 2001,
okay.
just to talk about it, because that was sort of, and I know it's not really the case, it's sort of the vintage in which it became a little bit more you.
Yeah.
And it's very important to stress also that this isn't a domain where there is a winemaker, maybe more so in the days when it was Jacques running it, admittedly with his right-hand man, Christophe Morin. But these days, it's very clearly the family in general. Whether it's Jeremy, his wife Diana, his brother Alec, other brother Paul is less involved, but Father Jacques is certainly still there, working through the harvest,
For sure.
sitting down, taking all the measurements, the weights, and the rest of it. So it is a communal effort. And I was at Domaine Dujac having a tasting with Diana at the 2020s the other day, and she told me off a strip for talking about somebody being a winemaker. She said, "There's no such thing. It's a group effort. It's the whole team," which I certainly understand. So 2001, there was a story going around with some of the less intelligent commentators that the style had changed because, and it's all because of the change of generation, etc., etc. A, I don't think it's really true, and B, I think the change in your extended cellar has made a difference.
Yeah.
And how do you feel about that? Old canard.
When you change, when I started showing my face at the Domaine and giving tastings and so on, which was in the mid-90s, during my parents would have me give tastings when I was away from school, and I started hearing my father was still completely in charge. I did the bucket cleaning in the cellar and in the winery, and I'd start hearing from comments about it's not like how it used to be, and so it's a very common thing, and the fact is I think people were less aware, we're just not that aware of the fact that my father changes winemaking quite a lot from year to year, and because they saw the same person, then that change was not so obvious to them. But in 2001 there were some real changes. So in 2000 we bought our first destemmer. Up till then we borrowed destemmers, but in 2000 we bought it. And I had very little say in the 2000 harvest, but we destemmed quite a lot of grapes in 2000. So the wines have a bigger percentage. And I can't remember, unfortunately, whether the Gruenchers you're going to taste was destemmed or not. But normally Gruenchers we do not destem. So I think there's a good chance that would have been very whole cluster.
They haven't got Gruenchers.
I think no? 2000.
Jasper.
Oh, you have, it's 2000 Gruenchers.
Yeah, 2000 Gruenchers.
Yeah.
So that one we don't typically destem, but it might have been. 2001 Clos St Denis, I think we destemmed about 40%. We've dropped the amount of destemming since. But
everybody said at the time out there in the marketplace that the wines had got much darker in color in 2001, and that's clearly not true.
So yeah, no, and well, it was the color. So there's a funny thing that happens. So the timing of malolactic impact your stabilization. Thank you. Stabilization of your friend after all. Stabilization of color. So if you do an early malo, you stabilize your color later and in bottle. So your wines tend to darken in bottle. If you do a later malo, you stabilize earlier, and you go into bottle pretty much the color that you will be later. So early on, the wines were darker than they used to be, and then things caught up.
It's really lovely, that 2001 Clos St Denis. Have you got those wines too? Yeah.
Yes, we have both. We have both wines with us now.
Yeah. And it strikes me as being 100% totally in a happy place to drink. We are drinking it out of half bottles. Jeremy is tasting it out of half bottles. I'm drinking it out of half bottles. It's just a gorgeous long aftertaste, but it is light on its feet, but with the length and the elegance and the style of a great Grand Cru. We're going to leave you in a minute for you to have your dinner proper, but do you have some last questions you'd like to ask Jeremy?
Yeah, when's the Clos de la Roche Cuvée 68 coming from Pearl Burgundy?
I think there's probably a fairly simple one-word answer to that, isn't it?
Don't buy it.
No, I mean, I think it has been exaggerated. I can understand why people might want to do it, and certainly why merchants might want to do it. But we have the experience of both Fred and Christophe in Musigny and Bon Mar, when they played around in the late 80s with special cuvées and immediately realized it was the wrong way to go and stopped doing it. I suppose it's fair enough if you have a big amount of your old vines, your special bit, that you could just make. So you've already made a cuvée that's 10 barrels of size, and you just take 2 barrels out for special bottling. If you want to do that, fine, but it's a distraction from the real wine. So I'm really echoing what Jeremy said before.
So I have been playing around with a special cuvée, which I realized my brother accidentally served to Neil Martin, and so now it's in print. But we have a tiny piece of Chambolle in a place called Argières. So it's north-facing village Chambolle, high up on the slope, actually in a very nice geology because it's in the same altitude curve as Musigny, and but it's north-facing. And all my other Chambolle is quite early ripening. So I was putting roughly 1.5 barrels worth of Argier into my other Musigny and my other Chambolle, which was, it was much less right. And because there's at least a 10-day picking difference would be the ideal between those two wines. So not in 2021 because there was just too little wine, but in 2019 and 2020, I made it separately because I was curious to see it. And I even bottled it separately to put for a friend. But anyway, that's not something that I intend to dabble in too much in future. I would like to separate the Premier Crus of Moët, and that's the real thing that I want to add to the roster.
So,
I think I just have a quick comment. Yeah, just a quick comment, which is that I mean these wines are so different. I mean the 05 Malconsorts has a certain rusticity to it, and it's even browner in colour than the 01 Clos St Denis, and clearly, you know, it's not a Dujac. I would say it's not a Dujac style wine, as I understand it. But I don't know what other people think. Yeah. I mean, the Clos St Denis is absolutely in the 01. It's absolutely in the slot, and it's actually fresher and more vibrant than the Malconsorts.
I mean, I don't think the colour of our Malconsorts wasn't noticeably browning in any way of ours, but I take that basic point.
Well, I do think that also they go through phases, and I've been surprised by. So our 95s, I feel, sometimes do that, where you open them and they feel a little bit oxidative and a little bit brown, and then you give them an hour in the decanter and they tend to liven up and freshen up. So I'm assuming that what I'm seeing as oxidation is not necessarily that. But 05 that's a vintage which is one of those famous great vintages where probably most of the wines will not be drunk at peak, or you know, people check in on them and still not ready, which is in contrast with the 14s where every bottle will deliver some pleasure. So there's I feel a bit ambivalent. The 05s, some of the wines are marked by heat stress. What 05s do you have? You have Cru Roche and.
Yeah, we haven't had the trip.
Yeah, no, we haven't.
You will be having. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry. So Malconsorts and Cru Roche. The Cru Roche was definitely, there was a little bit of drying tannin to it. I think we dodged the true hard drying tannin, but in a way, 05 had some elements in common with the semi-6 that you're having later, which some bottles of semi-6 can be great. Some of them can be just a little tannic and drying. This is why we should leave you to your meal probably, because a little bit of protein can solve that immediately and make it a naturally delicious experience. So, but as far as I'm concerned, 05 so far seems to be aging at a glacial pace and seems to be doing well with that. But Burgundy aging is somewhat sinusoidal. You have wines that are
Sinusoidal?
sinusoidal.
That's a good one. That's a new word for me.
It's very useful, but it goes through ups and downs. There's periods where the wines feel older than they should, and they feel younger again, and until they stabilize when they're around the 20-year-old mark, and then they feel very, very, very steady. But we drank a lot of our 85s thinking these are going over the hill, these are going over the hill, and actually now they're quite reliably delicious. So.
Big thank you for Jeremy for a great display of beautiful wines. And we will leave you to enjoy your dinner.
I'll serve you some 2010s, which are in good nick when you visit at some point.
Yeah. Good to see you all. Bye. Bye.